Okay, so today we are going to look at cell structure and function. So we're going to take a closer look at these little tiny microscopic building blocks that make up you and me and every other living thing on this planet that we live on. And so we're going to look at their structure. So we're going to examine um, kind of what they look like, how they're built, how they're made, and their function. So function means what their job is, what their role is, or what they do. And what we hope to see is that there is a relationship between these two terms, that cells and the different parts of cells, um, they're made the way they are. They look the way that they look. Um, in order to help them do the job that they're supposed to do. So there's a relationship between structure and function. All right, so that's where we're going today. We'll start off by looking at our learning targets, our goals for the day. By the end of this lesson, it's my hope that you're able to first off discuss what we call the cell theory, and I'll introduce that cell theory to you in just a minute. I hope that you'll be able to compare and contrast two different types of cells. So prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. I hope that you'll be able to tell how they're alike and how they're different. And since those two terms are such a mouthful to say, we'll shorten that down a little bit and we'll say prokes and euks. So we're going to compare and contrast those two different types of cells. We want to be able to identify the different parts or components of cells. Components are, it means the parts of, so the different cell components, and we call those little parts of a cell organelles. So we're going to be able to identify the different organelles. And then lastly, or probably most importantly, we want to be able to describe what those organelles look like, again, what their structure is, and we want to be able to describe their function, the role that they do, or the job that they do. And again, hopefully see how those two terms are related together, how their structure plays a role in their function. All right? So that's where we're going. Now, we'll start off with a quick look at what we call our cell theory. And that term theory gets thrown around and misused a little bit on TV shows, in general conversation. A lot of times we say that we have a theory on something, when really probably a better term is a hypothesis for what we have. But in any case, that term theory in the scientific community is a very, very powerful concept. When something achieves the status of a theory, that means it's the very best explanation that we have up to this point. It has been tested time and time again, and it has held up to all of those tests. So a theory is not just some wild random idea. When we say the cell theory, we're saying, hey, this is our very best understanding about cells. We believe these things to be true. We've got little to no evidence to show us otherwise. All right, so our cell theory's got three basic statements, starting with number one, which is all living things are composed of, made up of cells. Now that's a pretty simple, basic statement, but it's a very powerful statement. Because using that one little statement there, we can determine if something's a living thing or not. It says all living things are composed of cells. So if it's composed of cells, it's probably a living thing. If it's not composed of cells, it's not a living thing. Right? So a pretty basic statement, but again, a very, very powerful one. Now that lets me address one misconception that I sometimes see 8th grade students come in with. They oftentimes come into class with kind of a general understanding of what cells are. Maybe they've looked at some under the microscope, or they've heard of some of the different parts of the cell. So they have this thought that, okay, I have these cells, that okay, there's me, and then I have these cells. But probably a better way of thinking about it is that you are cells. You are a um, grouping, a conglomeration of cells that are all working together. And every single part of you, from your bones to your skin to your blood, all your different organs, liver, heart, lungs, brain, your nerves, your hair, all of these different things, all these different parts of you, and all the different parts of any living thing are made of cells. And so, I don't want you to have this idea that, okay, there's me, and then I have a few cells. And you are made up of cells. Okay? So while we're on that, the second statement of the cell theory kind of plays right along with that. And that statement says that cells are the basic units. So by basic units, we mean they're kind of the smallest, simplest parts in living things, basic unit of structure and function in living things. So kind of what we're saying there is that cells are the smallest part of a living thing that can still look and act and do the things that living things have to be able to do. So we talked earlier in the year about those different characteristics of living things. Well, single individual cells on their own can do all of those 6 different characteristics of living things that we talked about. They can grow and develop and respond to a stimulus. All of those different characteristics that we mentioned. Cells are the smallest parts of a living thing that all on their own can still do all of those things. All right, so that's what we mean by the basic units of structure and function. And then our last statement of the cell theory is that new cells are produced from existing cells. So cells, living things, don't just pop up out of the blue from nowhere. They come from cells that existed before. New cells can come from old cells. That's what we're saying there. That life and living things don't just spring up randomly out of the blue. All right, so that's our cell theory, our 3 statements of the cell theory. All living things are composed of cells, are made of cells. Cells are the basic units of structure and function in living things, and new cells are produced from existing cells. And again, that's kind of our very basic understanding, our best explanation for these little things that we call cells. Now, notice that it is the cell theory, and we know that there's one more step up above that. There's the we could call it the cell law, but it's not the cell law because it doesn't explain everything. And so if we take a look at some exceptions or some things that don't exactly fit into our cell theory, I think you'll see why that is. Now, on this slide, there'll be some things on here in red on your notes. You don't have to write down the stuff that's in red. It just goes a little further into explaining what's going on. So all you have to worry about in your notes is just taking down the stuff that's in black. But our exceptions to the cell theory are kind of our reasons why this is the cell theory and not the cell law. First off, we have things like viruses and other things like prions. I don't know if you may have heard of those in the news. Mad cow disease is caused by a prion. You guys are familiar with viruses, but they are, little small, kind of cell-like things, but on their own they can't do anything. They have to kind of get inside of a cell and then kind of take over. They kind of hijack cells and take over. So like viruses are mainly made up of some protein and some nucleic acids and some DNA or RNA, but they don't have a cell membrane, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have cytoplasm, they don't have any of this other stuff that we see in normal cells. So they're not made out of cells. So and all on their own, they don't do anything. They don't act alive. They don't do those 6 different characteristics of living things. Only after they've taken over a host cell do we see them able to do some of those characteristics of living things. So according to our cell theory, we would have to say no, viruses are not alive. but yet they sort of act like living things. So, it doesn't exactly jive up with our cell theory. All right, second up, we have a couple of little cell parts that we'll talk about a little later, but the mitochondria and the chloroplast, those are a couple of little organelles within the cell that kind of do their own thing within the cell. They have their own genetic material, so their own set of instructions, and they reproduce on their own. So within any one cell, you're probably going to find several mitochondria, and if it's a plant cell or something like that, you'll see several chloroplasts usually, and they reproduce on their own without getting their instructions from the nucleus. So they almost act like their own living things within a cell. So we said back in the cell theory that cells were the basic units of structure and function, but yet mitochondria and chloroplasts sort of act like living things, and they're even smaller than cells themselves. So, again, kind of a sketchy, kind of a gray area there. And the last exception to the cell theory, one that you may have thought of yourself when we were talking about the third statement of the cell theory, that new cells come from existing cells. Well, if that's the case, if all new cells have to come from existing cells, where did the first cell or the first cells come from? And that's something that we can't answer with the cell theory, and we really don't attempt to answer with the cell theory. It's kind of what came first, and again, with the cell theory, we're not trying to explain where those first cells came from. What we're trying to explain is where current and future cells arose from. All right, so for those three reasons, we call it still the cell theory, and it probably will be the cell theory because there's not really any good answer to these three exceptions, but it's still a pretty powerful set of statements that allows us to get a really good understanding as to what's going on with these cells. All right, yeah. If we if we look at cells, we see that they all have some certain things in common. They all have some certain parts. Every cell and every living thing that we know of has three parts that we call basic cell structure. So by basic, we mean that even the most simple cells has these three parts. So that starts out with the cell membrane. That's one thing that all cells have, going around the kind of the outside, separating what's inside the cell from what's outside the cell. All cells have cytoplasm, which is kind of this jelly-like material that's inside that cell membrane. And then all cells have some form of genetic material, so some DNA in there. So all cells have to have those three parts. And there's one part that students usually ask about at this point in the lecture. They'll say, well, what about the nucleus? That's the brain of the cell. And all cells have to have a nucleus? And the answer to that is no. Not all cells have a nucleus. And in fact, that's going to be one of the distinguishing characteristics between the two major types of cells that we talk about here in just a second. So all cells have to have a cell membrane, they have to have cytoplasm, they have to have some genetic material, some DNA or RNA. They do not have to have a nucleus.